Hey there, Terry. Thanks for joining us here on the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are excited to have you on this week's episode. We think the pebble that's in your shoe is going to kind of inspire and be helpful for many educators. So thanks for joining us. And how's everything going over on your end?
Things are going really well. We're having a nice, relaxing summer where it feels like when we are getting together as a teaching staff, we have had a couple professional development kind of optional days that we've been able to get together and work. But this is the first summer in two that we haven't just been talking about COVID and how to survive. So
exactly,
it's been a really I'd say reviving summer in that way to be able to start this fall, hopefully normal, whatever that looks like. So
absolutely. It's almost like you're hearing more and more people from all over the world starting to sort of bring the focus back to pushing their own learning forward and sort of like getting, continuing maybe where we left off before all of this began. Instead of, as you said, it's like that survival mode that's sort of been just occupying all of our time, our effort, our energy. So that's awesome to hear that you're sort of seeing that light and it's sort of coming to fruition here this summer. Before we dig in, tell us a little bit about your background story. Where are you coming to us from, and what's your role in education, and how did you end up in education altogether?
All right, great. First of all, thank you for having me. I was so excited when you invited me on the podcast. There's a pretty large group of our math staff at the elementary school that I teach at that listen to your podcast, and you come up a lot in professional development. So we've been, they're all excited that I'm going to get to do this too. So pretty cool. But my name is TL Eller. It's Terry Lynn, but I actually go by my initials TL.
Okay.
And I am a fourth grade math, science, and social studies teacher in Grove City, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour north of Pittsburgh. And I actually just finished my 20th year teaching.
Nice. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And I actually spent many of those years not teaching math at all. I got my master's in special education. And so about, I would say 12 of those years, I was teaching pull-out direct instruction in reading. So I would work with students with varieties, many different types of learning difficulties, but students with specific learning disabilities, speech and hearing impairments, visual impairments, you name it, students with autism, ADHD. So working with, a variety of students that kind of were, for whatever reason, needed direct instruction pulled out. And then about 8 years ago, our district started kind of realigning what they were doing, and I had the opportunity to push into a co-taught math class. And I was super excited about that because even though I had spent all of those years teaching reading, I actually was always a math person. My undergrad, we had to pick an area of emphasis, and I had picked science and math. So I was excited to get the opportunity to go back into a math classroom. So pushed into that math classroom, and it was actually a class, we were ability grouping at the time. So it was a class of, we'll say, the 25 lowest achieving students in fifth grade. So they were, my students with IEPs were in that class, but it was also students without IEPs. So there was myself, a regular ed teacher, and the Title I teacher all teaching in that class. And about the second day in, I realized that we had a classroom full of kids who were all terrified of the subject. We would just, some days we would just look at each other like we didn't even know what to do. We would ask a question and they would kind of just stare at us blankly. And it hit me because it wasn't just my learning support students that were afraid of the subject. It was all of them. So, it was great because there were three of us and we were able to do a lot of small group things, but you guys often say you're saying it like louder and slower, but we weren't really doing anything different. That's what we were doing. It never even really occurred to us that we could teach math differently.
Right.
So then, and this is kind of the moment where I became a math teacher. I had a specific student who was receiving emotional support services, and he also was legally blind. And we were doing long division, and we were teaching it the traditional way with the algorithm. And you can imagine how frustrated and angry this student became pretty quickly because we were saying it louder and slower. And in this student's case, it was an accommodation that we had to enlarge his textbook. So we were also using this like larger than
larger, louder, and slower.
Yeah.
And so we were doing, I'm like embarrassed to say this out loud, but so the does McDonald's serve cheeseburgers kind of acronym, and we're going through the checks. And
we all did it.
Yeah. Okay. We're going over the problems over and over and over again. And he finally looked at me and was like, why in the bleepity bleep bleep
right
would you have a blind kid do this? Like that was his comment to me. And we shut the book right then and there, and we went for a walk because I didn't have an answer for that. Like, why am I having a blind student do this? So that's kind of what jump started thinking about, like, there has to be a better way. So and started really looking. We had a district math coach who was awesome, who I started having some conversations with. My sister is actually also a math educator. She teaches pre-service teachers. So she's a professor of math education. I started talking with her, and she kind of led me to some of Joe Bowler's work and her UCube site. So we started looking there. And so eventually, like, we just started making small systematic changes, started having some success, and it became the thing that I was really passionate about. So eventually a year or two later, I got to move into the regular classroom and start teaching math, science, and social studies so I could really focus on math. That's when I found your podcast, and it opened me up to this whole new world of there's so many great people out there in mathematics pushing, good, solid research-based practices. So that's kind of how I am where I am now.
Awesome story there. And I think your passion is showing just in the way you've told that story about, your journey. And you're right. Like I feel like our math community is so supportive and sharing of resources and helping each other change instruction. And I think it's helped us. I know that Kyle and I wouldn't be here without that math community as well, doing what we're doing here. You shared I think you shared a math moment about your teaching career that kind of made you pivot and rethink the way that you were teaching. And that was a very clear math moment for you. But I'm wondering if we want to stretch back to think about your math moment yourself, like how you viewed math, maybe younger. If you can go back to then, what would be a math moment that when we say math class, like this moment just sticks out with you?
Yeah. So my math moment, very different. I would say my math philosophy as a student was so different than as a teacher. So I was trying to think, because math was always my favorite subject. I always really connected with my math teachers. And so, like I said, I'd listened to the podcast knowing that you were going to ask this. I was kind of thinking, like, why was that the case? Like, why did I love math so much? And I kind of traced it back to third grade. It was the year that we were learning our multiplication facts. And I was really struggling to learn those facts. I was struggling to memorize them and do that, and just struggling in math. And I guess to fully understand this, you need to know that my dad was a basketball coach. He was like an old school, he was the varsity basketball coach. And in our house, hard work was like a thing that was very valued. And so when we were struggling with something, we were expected to work even harder,
Right.
So in third grade, I was coming home and we were playing Around the World like everybody does, right? And at that time to practice. And I was expressing my frustration that I wasn't doing well. And so what we did was we dove into learning those facts the only way they knew, which was straight memorization, right? So we would get up at 5:30 in the morning and practice before school started, and we would do all these things. But eventually I worked hard enough that I was like the queen of Around the World, which was like also being a coach's kid, like competition was a thing. Like I really liked that. So what I think happened for me is math became the subject that I could like outwork my opponent. I could outwork. And because that just related so well with me and like kind of the values that I was brought up with, like my dad for years had like a copy of the textbook. And I think secretly, like he wasn't the best math student when he was younger. So he was learning it alongside of me and he was like, it was more for him sometimes than me.
Yeah, sure.
But we would get up in the morning and we would study together. And I remember like some of my even junior high math teachers saying like, you can practice until you get this. And so I think that's why early on, like even with that 5th grade math class, like that's why like I thought like if we could just get them as passionate about working hard and feeling that success, but it never occurred to me that there might actually be an easier way than what I was doing. And watching my own daughter, who's in 3rd grade now, like, well, she'll be in 4th grade next year, but this past year, like she didn't have to study those facts the way we did because she learned strategies and so I think that as successful as I was, it was more in memorizing procedures and doing what I was told, but I found joy in that. I found joy in working hard and trying to be the best at that.
Yeah, this is so interesting. So, you like, it's so connected. So your memory is very connected to what we're going to be discussing today. So I kind of want to almost segue right into it here. And it sounds like, and I'm going to make a couple connections here that I'm making, because hearing your story about long division, for example, and, sort of realizing at the time that, really the student helping you to realize that, maybe what we're doing right now might not be, not to say it's not valuable, but maybe there's a different way or a better way. And you came to that realization. And then reflecting back on how hard you worked in order to learn those facts yourself, I think something we also have to remember is that working hard is something we still want to value in math class.
Absolutely.
But I wonder, like, where's that spot before, especially for those students who might disengage? So you were a student who grew up in a household where that work ethic, that was something that was instilled in you, and that worked for you. But then we start to zoom out and look at the other students that may not have had that same experience. So I wonder, how do we help bring that to them, but in a way that isn't going to necessarily like push them away? So I'm wondering, when you think about your students in your classroom, you can probably imagine that if you come at it the way maybe your parents did, after years of kind of conditioning you to sort of respond in a way, if you came out the gate like that and a student's never had that, that might come off as a bad thing. So I wonder if there's like an in-between there. And, I want to pause and sort of give you an opportunity to maybe compare and contrast those, the world that you grew up in, and then maybe the world that your daughter's growing up in being a little bit different.
Right. I think that the biggest difference that I see at least is the way that we're kind of approaching teaching multiplication now is a way that the students are encouraged to have some understanding and not just like memorize those facts. That's so cute. So like for me, it was frustrating for me to study over and over and over again, but eventually like I was rewarded for that hard work and I had encouragement at home. But I think for some of my students, they don't have maybe that encouragement at home. Maybe their parents, are just as frustrated with math as they are. They don't have someone at home to practice with them. So I think that by providing them like a deeper understanding of the facts and the strategies and what it actually is, and in our curriculum, we build tons of arrays, and we call it hidden arrays, where they're looking for hidden arrays within those facts. And so it gives them that meaning where they're no longer afraid to kind of take that leap, and then they start having small successes. Like for us, the biggest difference for me is now when I say to a student, what's 6 times 4? And they don't know it, it's not just defeat, because I can say to them, well, do you know 6 times 2? And how can that help you find 6 times 4? Where before, if I said to a child, like, what's 6 times 4? And they said, I don't know. I'd say, well, darn, we need to memorize that.
Right. Yeah, here's a different one that's completely unrelated, right?
Right, exactly. So I think that might be the biggest thing, is it's just allowing students to have like those little successes along the way, and it's not as defeating.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think we have to agree that strategies is more important than facts. But I TL, I'm wondering, you reached out to us about some of the curriculum resources that you're using and some of the, the limitations that you're experiencing, and then you kind of wanted to dive deeper into thinking about how to assess some mathematical facts. I'm wondering if you want to elaborate on your struggle or your pebble right now, that we can dig into here in this conversation, and so that we can kind of figure out a pathway forward.
Yeah, that would be great. So our district moved to standards-based grading 4 years ago. We moved to standards-based grading 4 years ago, and also got a new curriculum, and also then had COVID all in the same year. So that was,
Of course.
yeah, those were some interesting challenges. But we have our third and fourth grade teams have kind of been going back and forth with, first of all, I guess there's two parts of it. First of all so we have proficiency scales, and we have like approaching standard, at standard proficient is like kind of where we're looking at right now. And for the first thing that we keep kind of saying that we're going to come back to, and we're just kind of talking in circles, is what should a student who is proficient at their multiplication facts, like what should that look like? Like what is the expectation? And then once we kind of agree upon that, how do we assess it? So like I'm actually looking at our proficiency scale right now, and we have like our curriculum encourages a bunch of different strategies. So right now it says like approaching standard would be that like students are familiar with those strategies and kind of using them. And then kind of the ultimate goal is that they're choosing the most efficient of those strategies. But I'm not sure that we all agree on like what is the most efficient, and is the most efficient for one student the most efficient for another. Like, and then we've read a lot of Nikki Newton's work, and she, has, I love everything about what she has, but there are some things like they do talk about automaticity in there. And it's like, what does automaticity look like? Does that mean that they have to be memorized, or can they be using a strategy quickly and efficiently? There's just a lot of things that have come up in our conversations that we're just trying to kind of iron out so we can be consistent with the way we're assessing these kiddos.
Yeah. And you brought up a lot of really interesting pieces here. So I just want to restate them because, to just make sure everybody's clear in the way I'm hearing this pebble is like, you're like, obviously there's a value there. You value that students obviously learn facts so that they don't have to maybe spend as much time and effort thinking them through. However, not saying that you just want them to know those facts. You also want them to leverage strategies. And I loved your example of, having one of the factors to help them maybe potentially use a doubling strategy there. So that's a great facilitator move in order to help those students along. And what it sounds like is your real challenge here is like, how do I assess? And then probably even more so, how do I evaluate, students' proficiency, fluency, automaticity you had brought up. I always look at the word automaticity and I sort of leverage a Kathy Fosno style definition of automaticity. And, the example I always use is like memorization is something that and you've maybe had to create some sort of mnemonic to memorize because there's no like logic or reasoning to it. So for example, the code to my garage door, I memorized, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just 4 digits, or my phone number was assigned to me. So, I make a mnemonic maybe to help me with some of the numbers there, but really there's no reasoning through that. Whereas in math, and in particular math facts, everything can be reasoned through. And that's where the entrance of strategies come in. And that's where I believe automaticity is, where students have more known facts. So they build these known facts, but how they were built was based on connections, was based on reasoning. So at the end of the day, I'm looking for like evidence of students being able to reason through problems. But at some point, we're hoping, the hope is, this may not happen for all students, but the hope is that students will walk out of my classroom knowing a significant number of facts based on the grade level that I'm teaching, right? So whatever's realistic for that grade level. And in standards, a lot of times here in Ontario, there are certain math facts that we focus on in different grades. And we're using a lot of this similar language, strategies, models in order to help them.
Right.
Now, this puts you in a tough spot because I would argue from an assessment standpoint, right? I'm looking at this and I want to give students as many opportunities throughout the school year to continue moving along their own journey. But the evaluating part is where things get hard. And I think, and this is my opinion, I'm wondering, John, I'm going to tag you in here to kind of get your thoughts on this as well. But my thought is when we evaluate, that's more or less sort of saying where students are after the learning has happened, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm less interested in the whole evaluation part and really interested in the assessment part to help each student get further on their journey. Because the reality is that there are going to be some students who are not going to know all of their facts to 12 times 12. But if I can help all students arrive at those facts through strategies, and when we talk about efficiency as well, efficiency is also based on the student themselves, like what's efficient to them at their spot in the journey is going to be very different than what's efficient for maybe me or maybe you, who is at a very different place in our journey. John, like, what are your thoughts based on that before we flip it back?
Yeah, I was actually wanting to flip it back because I'm curious, TL, to know what you've done so far in kind of trying to think about this assessment journey that your students are on, or like I know you're trying to align assessment and what it looks like to be proficient at multiplication facts, but what have you done so far that has left you going, I don't think we're doing it right?
Well, and I don't know if it's as much as I think we're doing pieces of it right. I think that like the thing that I do that I like the most, that I think gives me the most information, is we do a lot of small group like thinking task type things we have an intervention time. So when I'm working with those students and I'm seeing them either build arrays and think through those facts, or as the year progresses, like, and we're working on multi-digit multiplication and they're using different strategies. And then I can kind of see how they're like a student who doesn't know 7 times 6. And then they figure it out. Like I can observe, like, were they drawing circles and doing loops and groups and they're kind of still in the counting phase? Or did they say to me, well, I know 7 times 5 and I can add another 7 and get 42. Like, the observation piece I'm getting, but I just don't feel like, so we keep these data binders for standards and our kids are self-reflecting all the time about kind of where they're at. And I don't feel like we have a consistent way for those kids to really know what they know and what they don't know about those facts, the way we do the other standards. Like, if that makes sense. Like I'm wanting them to be able to really like own and think about the strategies that they're using and even become more efficient with those strategies. And I don't feel like I have the information, or like I think I know where they're at with their facts, but the only thing that our curriculum provided for us are these timed assessments, which is so weird to me because it's the opposite of the way everything it's teaching. We're teaching all these great strategies and encouraging all the uses of strategies and different models with ratio tables and number lines. But then we're assessing with these time facts. And it's funny because it's so not, we did 1 in 9 weeks just so I'd have some data. And like, it's so not part of the culture of our room that like, they just like, they don't even like, we're constantly saying speed isn't important. And then I give them this, and that's just not even the way they think, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I just feel frustrated that I don't have kind of consistent information. And this piece that's so important, like, you know, constantly from 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade teachers, like they don't know their facts. Like we need to, you know, I'm not sure. I want to have a way that the kids can kind of own it.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Gotcha. I guess so. When you referred to your other standards, not facts, you had this like way for students to understand how they're doing. You're saying you're doing a better job there, but not with math facts. What do you think is the difference between the facts and then the standards? Because certain standards are, can I do these things, or can I do these? Do I know these things? But facts, the multiplication math facts sound very similar in a sense of like, can I do this, or am I approaching this? Like what's different between what you're doing over here, where you're feeling more success with students understanding where they are on that journey, and not over here?
I guess it's the assessments.
Okay.
Like we feel like we have tasks that the students are doing for each of our different proficiency scales, or we've kind of combined, like we don't always do unit assessments, but we do have some unit assessments, but we feel like they're even more like task-based types of questions that the students are getting. And it feels like they complete that assessment and they have a really good picture of where they're at. And then they can kind of keep working. And then we have other tasks where they have an opportunity to go back and revisit that standard and do that. And there's just so much with multiplication facts, I guess. So in fourth grade, that you had mentioned like certain facts for certain grades. And what's interesting is actually in Pennsylvania, our standard for third grade, it's like 0 through 9 facts. And then in fourth grade, it actually goes away. Like we kept this proficiency scale score this proficiency scale in fourth grade, because we know realistically not all of our students come proficient in their facts from third to fourth grade, but it actually like disappears in Pennsylvania. Like it's not an expectation for us to continue to practice it, but we want to, because it's important to us. But it's a lot. Like I kind of was thinking like I wanted a way like to know if they've become kind of automatic with their 2s, 5s, and 10s, because those are kind of foundational facts that help with all the strategies of the others. Like I was just trying to think of a way to organize it so kids can kind of self-evaluate and kind of set goals the way we do with our other, like our place value, for example. Like there's comparing rounding and word forms, and they work on that, and we have these tasks, and then they know like I'm not proficient at this yet because I haven't mastered rounding yet. And it's very intentional with what they know they're practicing. But with the facts, I don't know, like I can give them that too and say, well, you're approaching the standard because my gut is telling me that they're just not quite efficient enough yet. But I don't feel like I'm giving the students the feedback that they need to know where to go from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I wanted to ask one more question before, and then I've got sort of like an idea, like not sort of like the answer, but something that might help you in terms of like landing on maybe a tool or like a process that you might be able to use to kind of help you get closer to this goal that you have. I'm curious about, would you say maybe in your classroom, maybe in your school, would you say that like number talk routines, is that something that is pretty common in your grade, across the grades, maybe a bit of both? What do you think?
So Pamela Harris is a 3 to 5 co-author of the curriculum that we adopted. So problem strings in 3 to 5 are a part of our at least weekly routine. There's a ton of problem strings that we do, which I know is a little different than a number talk, but same kind of thing. But yeah, I would say that it's very much in the culture of our school.
Awesome.
And the way the curriculum is written. Yes.
Yeah. And I would be honest and say that the way Pam Harris runs her math talks, her problem strings, very similar to Kathy Fosno, very similar to Math Moment units. For those who have never explored those Math Moment units that we have throughout our unit, we have problem strings, related problems. And so that's great to hear. So again, sort of helps to paint us a picture again about the importance of strategies, of reasoning, of models. All of those things are happening there if you're leveraging, work like Pam or Kathy or the Math Moments resource. So awesome to hear. It sounds like to me that what you're kind of trying to figure out is like, so you had mentioned about how you want students to kind of know where they are. You obviously want to know where they are too. But you also want to give them an opportunity to kind of know where they're at and where they want to move to next. So I'm sort of, you had mentioned this time testing thing. And time testing, I know there's lots of research that suggests why time testing isn't a great idea. There are some maybe reasons why you might do, we'll call it like hidden timed testing, if that makes sense. Like we don't want it to necessarily be a race, but if that's a metric that's going to help you assess how students are building their automaticity, like it's all very fragile to talk about, because I personally, I'm not so concerned about a student getting X number of problems done after X number of time. I can tell pretty quickly, like having gone into schools, working and interviewing students from various schools, various areas of our district, 76 schools in total. I go in, I could sit down, I can ask a student a question, and within about 10 seconds, I have a sense of whether it's automatic, whether they are reasoning through it, or whether they're just sort of like totally guessing. So I guess my question to you might be, what do you hope that they have? So we talked about efficiency, right? Whether they have this automaticity idea. Like when you have automaticity, sometimes that's hard to tell. Like if a student already has automaticity with a certain fact, like they know 3 times 4 is 12, it's very difficult for you to know whether it was built through strategies or whether they just memorized that, right? So that becomes problematic unless you're there for that entire journey. So I guess the question would be is like, what do you want them to have? And how can I create or craft, maybe like I'm picturing you could almost have like your times table grid, and you could almost have like each box split up into little sections. It kind of reminds me of something like what Nikki Newton would do with her running records. But here, if it's specifically for times tables, each students could have that, and maybe each box is split up into 3 sections or 4 sections where you could, allow them to self-evaluate, right? Or assess, or maybe you could be assessing and like giving it back and forth to them to try to help them individually improve in those areas. But ultimately, for me, at the end of the day, in order to design this tool, you have to get clear on what it is you personally want them to have. Because for me personally, you had mentioned how after grade 3, the standard kind of disappears. Throughout our entire Math Moments catalog, all the way into the high school grades, everything we do is designed to be done without the use of a calculator to promote continually coming back. Because there's kids in grade 9 that still don't know all their facts. Right. And they don't have the strategies or the models yet in order to reason through them. So like for me personally, and I know John believes this as well, that to me is much more important than, let's say, them knowing the fact. Like I want that, but I can't force that. What I can do though, is I can set them up so that in every situation that they have a strategy and a model that's going to support them in getting where they want to get to. And I'm going to obviously promote practice, and I'm going to promote, continually getting better in these areas. But me personally, I'm not so concerned on the evaluation side, but I do wonder, like if you were able to help students with, let's say, I'll pick 6 times 7, because that's, a fact that maybe students struggle with, or 6 times 8. I'm wondering like about that fact. What do you want for students? Like what is it that you actually want to see when you ask students that question? And then what would you like physically be able to quickly jot down so that what you've recorded what you want, and then you've also provided enough information for that student. So I'll flip that back to you there, just to keep your sense of like, what do you hope in like a perfect world? You ask that question, and what would you like to see or hear?
Okay. So I think when I ask 6 times 8, what I want to see is that what I'm trying to push them towards for 4th grade is that they have mental math strategies. So at the beginning of the year, they might model that in some way, but my goal is that they can do that eventually in their head. So like 6 times 4 is 24, double it and get 48. And where my students usually come at the beginning of the year, some of them can do that. Some of them know it automatically, but the ones who are struggling with the standard are the ones who they have to draw a picture to really kind of get that out, or they're drawing all of their 6s and combining them into 12s and they eventually get to 48. To me, that's not quite efficient enough. Like I would like to see them have, I don't know that I feel like it needs to be automatic and that they can just tell me it's 6 times 8 is 48, but I'd like them to be able to do it in their head. Does that make sense? Like just have that strategy and, maybe with a quick, like writing down 6 times 4 is 24 and then they know to double it is 48. But I think the goal is to get them to be able to do that mostly in their head. And then something else that you said that it just made me think like, so as a math team, we've kind of defined fluency as we want the students to be efficient and we want them to be accurate, but we also want them to be flexible. So I think like for my students who really are like nailing the standard, I'm looking, could they show me multiple ways? Like, could they show me more than just that doubling strategy? Can they also, maybe use their 5s fact and add another 8 or something like that? So those are the pieces that I'm looking for.
Right. And when you say like, because when we go back to the struggle that you had in your sense of like, how do I kind of systematize this? But I think what you're elaborating right now is that you know what to look for. And it's almost like, can you set up some sort of like progression, right? It's like, okay, because when you work with a student, you want to know where are they on that journey? Can they be flexible? Like, have I seen them use multiple strategies to show this multiplication fact? Or have I only seen them use one strategy always? So like there's that like, hey, I'm checking off the box that they're flexible because I've seen this flexibility, but I'm not checking off the box of I'm flexible if I haven't. But you could also say I'm checking the box off on that student if I've seen them, memorize, but I haven't seen them kind of strategize. And so it's like, I can see them do it with their heads, but I haven't been able to kind of with confidence say they're doing all of these things. And it's like, once those boxes have been checked off that I'm seeing, hey, I'm seeing flexibility, I'm seeing strategies, and I'm seeing consistency along that line, that's when I can go, hey, they're at the standard or they've, exceeded the standard. And so it's like, what does that progression look like for you? Can I create that and then use that to help me measure students and where they are in that journey?
And one thing too that, you brought up here, John, that I think is important for us to at least be thinking about, because I think we're all with you. I bet you everybody who's listening is like, we want students to be flexible and fluent, and we want them to, not have, let's say, one go-to strategy, because maybe that's not always going to work. Maybe it's not always going to be efficient. It's like the example of subtracting, 1001 minus 999. If my only approach is the algorithm, then like, wow, that's a lot of work. It's like, that's showing a lack of flexibility, which kind of brings me back. You said something about, the end goal being like, we want to help students so that they can do more in their head, but do be cautious, because we don't want students to believe, and I know you're not saying this, but this is more for people listening. We don't want students to believe that not being able to do it in their head and having to use a visual model, we don't want them to look at that as a bad thing, because something that's interesting is some students that know all their facts can't model it at all on paper, and that's not good either. So it's like, when we talk about that proficiency standpoint, we want students to be strategically competent, right? We want them to have like some adaptive reasoning skills where they could actually, like, in one scenario, maybe do something like in our subtraction scenario, it doesn't really make sense to, use the takeaway standard algorithm model. And then the other piece is, I wonder if we want to get to assessing the flexibility, maybe it's less about, the day-to-day and more about during those problem strings, doing more assessing in terms of their flexibility. Because the reality is, for those who haven't checked out Pam Harris's work, Kathy Fosno's work, our work on the Math Moments site through all of our math talks, every string of problems has a specific model and strategy and or big idea that we're trying to elicit. So through that, the questions we craft are trying to get students to come to this realization that, hey, I can get there a different way. And we want to see if they're able to do that work. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, if I'm a person who really likes partial products and like that's kind of my go-to strategy, I also don't want to like make them feel as though, I know you're not punishing them. Like, we don't want them to feel as though it's like, well, I didn't use the strategy that Mr. Orr wanted, right? Or, I guess my strategy is not good enough, right? Like, so it's a kind of a fine line. So I would say trying to draw out those additional strategies through those number talk routines. And you had mentioned earlier about, if not every day, maybe weekly, like I would argue almost every day, anytime we're, in between problem-based lessons, having like a string of problems, and those strings could be crafted by ourselves, because I want to answer a question of like, hey, do they know a doubling and halving strategy, or are they able to do that work? If so, let's do this string and let me kind of assess how they're doing. Because the reality is if I see 6 times 7, I might resort to my same go-to strategy, but it doesn't necessarily mean I don't know other strategies, if you know what I mean. So it's a really tough thing to try to assess well, unless the problems we're giving them is sort of crafting that path or that story. And that's where those related problems are so helpful, because you essentially are working a pattern or a behavior of the mathematics out. And that behavior is what sort of, makes us as humans go, hey, I recognize this pattern and I'm going to maybe leverage that on the next problem in the string. Whereas if I just saw that one problem out in the wild, I might not leverage that same strategy. So there's all kinds of, thoughts kind of, and as we mentioned, we didn't want to give necessarily answers, but maybe things to think about, in particular, when you go back to your next PD session with your colleagues, to kind of discuss, and maybe as a team kind of like try to get that information out on the board as to like, what is it that we really want to see, and how do we want to track this with our students, so that we can feel good about the work that we're doing. Because it sounds like you're doing amazing work already. So I'm wondering, before we wrap up here, what would you say is like a big takeaway from today's conversation? And what's your next steps in your mind on where you're going to go next with this idea?
So I think my big takeaway is that, because just in hearing you talk about the problem strings and the different things, like I do think that is just part of our math culture, and we're doing that a lot. And I think I have a lot of information about my students up here that I see, but I think that I do need to develop a way of tracking. And I think I was really caught up maybe on having like some task that they could actually do, but I think that the daily tasks that we're doing, it might be enough information. It's just that I'm not recording that information. Like even with problem strings, there are things that I could see that if I could develop a way that I'm just like quickly writing down, like, this student did this, because I keep a lot of anecdotals in our small group and different things, but I haven't done that in problem strings. I've done it in other places, but maybe having a way to organize specifically for those fact strategies and the types of things that I'm seeing. Maybe I don't really need an assessment, so to speak, but just a better way of keeping track of what I'm seeing in my classroom every day.
Got it. Yeah. Like I'm envisioning something that can be helpful is oftentimes we talk about here on the podcast is that you don't have to give the same assessment to the whole class all the time. And it can be different things on different days. Like you could be looking for, I'm seeing this from these students today. I got to make a point to make sure I see that from those students on another day. So keeping some sort of record so that you can make those check boxes, and that can help you be quick, but also be accurate along that kid's, that student's journey on whatever, that progression that you're looking for. So I like that you're moving towards that. It makes sense that, hey, we've got all this information up here, And sometimes we need to translate that down here so it feels more real, but we know that we've got so much up here that is worthwhile and also like valid. Like your memories are completely valid as an assessment, a piece of evidence for that student. So moving forward here, we're excited for your journey and what your next steps are, which means that we do want to check back with you in
Great.
let's say 6 months, maybe 12 months. So next year, we'll set up a time to kind of check in so that see how things are going. Would you be open to that, kind of coming back on and sharing your journey so far?
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. That would be awesome.
Awesome stuff. So we'll make sure we reach out. But hey, TL, we want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode, and I can't wait to have you back.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Take care, my friend, and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thank you.